It is a remarkable thing how some people go through life without ever realizing the true worth of the person standing right beside them. When you look back on the experience, the pattern many narcissistic people follow can seem so consistent and so recognizable that it almost feels unbelievable once you finally understand it. If you have ever loved someone with these behaviors, if your care for them was deep and genuine, then you already know this experience all too well. You gave them patience during moments when they treated you unfairly. You offered kindness and understanding even when they became emotionally distant and cold. You stayed loyal even after they gave you many reasons to question whether they deserved that loyalty. Your love was never temporary or based on conditions. It was honest, dependable, and real. Yet they acted as though your love would always be there, no matter how they behaved. They treated it like something they owned, instead of something that should be appreciated. They moved through the relationship with an unspoken sense of entitlement, believing your support would never run out. They expected you to carry their fears, their confusion, and the emotional weight they refused to face themselves, without ever stopping to wonder how much pressure they were placing on your shoulders. The hardest part is that you allowed it for longer than you should have, because your love was sincere. You believed in who they could become, instead of accepting who they repeatedly showed themselves to be. You hoped that your patience, your consistency, and your loyalty would one day encourage them to grow. You kept believing that if you remained calm, caring, and committed, things would eventually become different. But keep watching, because this is where everything begins to change. There always comes a defining moment. Sometimes it arrives quietly, almost unnoticed. Other times it comes with shocking clarity. Either way, it changes everything. It is the moment you finally decide to walk away. You are not leaving because you want revenge. You are not leaving because you suddenly stopped caring. You leave because you finally understand that staying is costing you too much. You stop explaining your heart to someone determined to misunderstand it. You stop defending your intentions. You stop trying to convince someone of your value when they never truly wanted to recognize it in the first place. That silence becomes more powerful than every conversation you ever had. Your absence begins speaking in ways your words never could. Then, something unexpected starts happening inside the narcissist. It is not genuine personal growth. It is not deep accountability. It is something much more revealing. Once your absence breaks through the image they carefully created of being superior and completely in control, cracks begin to appear beneath the surface. The confidence they displayed for so long starts losing its strength because it depended far more on your constant presence than either of you realized. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next explains why so many narcissists react in ways that seem impossible to understand. For the first time, they are forced to face a reality they spent years avoiding. You were never as replaceable as they convinced themselves you were. During the relationship, they believed your loyalty would always remain. They assumed your forgiveness had no limits. They expected your understanding to continue no matter how many times they disappointed you. That belief became part of the foundation of their emotional world. But once you truly leave, that foundation begins to shake. They may try to hide it. They may pretend nothing has changed. They may quickly surround themselves with distractions or seek attention from someone new. From the outside, it can appear as though they moved on effortlessly. Yet appearances often tell only a small part of the story. Deep beneath the surface, your absence creates questions they cannot easily silence. Why did someone who loved them so deeply finally decide enough was enough? Why did the person who always stayed suddenly refuse to return? Those questions are uncomfortable because they challenge the version of reality they worked so hard to protect. They do not automatically become self-aware. Instead, they become unsettled. Their usual certainty begins to weaken. Their emotional balance becomes harder to maintain because the source of steady reassurance they relied upon is no longer available. And that shift often marks the beginning of a struggle they never expected to face. They are finally forced to accept a reality they spent a long time avoiding. You were never just another person in their life, and you were never truly required to stay. The certainty they depended on slowly begins to disappear. The control they believed they had over you starts slipping through their fingers. Suddenly, the person they once overlooked and took for granted becomes the very person they cannot stop thinking about. Understanding this turning point is important because it changes the way you see everything that happened. It helps you leave the past with understanding instead of confusion. When a narcissistic person finally realizes they have lost someone who truly loved them, the first emotion that often rises is overwhelming panic. It is raw, intense, and deeply unsettling. But it is important to understand what that panic really means. It is not the heartbreak that comes from losing a healthy relationship. It is not grief rooted in appreciation for genuine love. Instead, it is fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of watching the emotional system they depended on suddenly fall apart. For a long time, they quietly believed your love would always remain. They treated your care as though it existed beyond effort, respect, or mutual responsibility. They assumed your patience would never run out, your forgiveness would always return, and your presence would always be available, no matter how they behaved. They expected you to clean up after their mistakes, absorb their emotional storms, and carry burdens they refused to face themselves. In their mind, your loyalty was an endless supply they never had to earn. But stay with me, because what happens after you leave explains everything. The moment you stop reacting, stop explaining, stop fixing every problem, and stop rescuing them from the consequences of their own actions, something inside them begins to shift. They experience a sudden collapse of the emotional structure they unknowingly relied upon for stability. This happens because many narcissistic people never build a secure sense of self from within. Instead, they depend heavily on the reactions, attention, and emotional energy of others to hold together the image they have created. Once that source disappears, their inner world can become unsettled. Feelings they spent years avoiding suddenly rise to the surface. Their chest feels tight. Their thoughts race without direction. A heavy sense of anxiety settles deep inside them. These emotions feel unfamiliar because they never learned healthy ways to understand or regulate them. They do not fully understand what is happening. They simply know something feels deeply wrong. The carefully protected image of confidence, superiority, and complete control begins developing cracks. The stories they repeated to themselves no longer feel convincing. They once believed they could replace you whenever they wanted, or that you would never truly leave. They convinced themselves that you depended on them far more than they depended on you. Now those beliefs begin falling apart. Reality quietly pushes through the walls they spent years building, and they have no clear way to stop it. Keep watching because this next stage reveals even more about the pattern. As confusion grows, they search desperately for explanations that protect their self-image. Their thoughts become scattered. Their emotions become unpredictable. Sometimes their actions become rushed and impulsive. Rather than looking honestly at themselves, They often look for someone else to blame, because shifting responsibility has always been their safest escape. They begin rewriting the history of the relationship until it fits a version where they remain the injured person. They may insist that you were too emotional, too sensitive, or that you misunderstood everything that happened. They may claim you overreacted or walked away without reason. These explanations are not created to uncover the truth. They are created to protect them from facing it. Beneath every excuse lies a fear they rarely admit, even to themselves. It is the realization that they depended on you much more than they ever wanted to believe. You became a steady emotional presence in a life that often felt unstable beneath the surface. You absorbed insecurity, frustration, doubt, and emotional pressure without asking them to face those feelings alone. When that steady support disappears, they lose more than a relationship. They lose an emotional anchor that quietly held many parts of their inner world together. That absence leaves them feeling lost in ways they struggle to explain. Their mind becomes filled with restless questions. They wonder whether you have healed. They wonder if you have found someone who treats you with greater kindness and respect. They wonder if you have finally recognized the value they failed to appreciate. Without your constant reassurance, their thoughts become a battlefield of conflicting stories. One moment they tell themselves, "You never mattered." The next moment, they replay old memories they cannot seem to forget. They create explanations that blame you, then quickly replace them with stories designed to comfort themselves. Yet underneath every version sits a truth they cannot completely silence. They do care. Their ego simply cannot accept what those feelings truly mean. This is where the deeper unraveling begins. It starts almost invisibly before gradually gaining momentum, like threads slowly pulling apart from fabric that was never as strong as it appeared. They are not falling apart because they suddenly discovered healthy love. They are struggling because the control they believed was permanent has disappeared. They are trying to understand how someone they assumed would always remain finally chose themselves instead. No matter how carelessly they treated you, they often continue criticizing you because looking inward feels even more frightening. They create noise, conflict, and distractions because silence would force them to sit with thoughts they have spent years avoiding. Those quiet moments are often more uncomfortable than any argument. The anger that follows is frequently misunderstood. It does not come from real strength. It often grows from emotional instability, trying to appear powerful. Hidden beneath that anger is something their ego finds even more difficult to tolerate, and that is shame. This kind of shame does not gently encourage reflection or healthy change. Instead, it feels overwhelming, almost as though their entire identity is being threatened. It exposes the insecurity hidden beneath confidence, the emptiness concealed behind arrogance, and the fear buried underneath constant self-importance. When those uncomfortable feelings begin rising to the surface, bringing the familiar tight chest, heavy stomach, and deep sense of dread, they often cannot tolerate them for very long. Rather than sitting with those emotions, understanding them, or taking responsibility, they quickly transform that discomfort into anger. Anger feels safer. Anger creates distance from vulnerability. Anger allows them to focus on someone else instead of confronting themselves. And that reaction reveals far more about their inner struggle than it ever does about the person they lost. If you've experienced something similar, the next part becomes even more revealing, because it explains why their behavior often becomes so confusing after the relationship ends. Because those feelings of shame become almost impossible for them to tolerate, they push them away from themselves. Instead of facing their own pain, they project it onto you. They place their insecurities in your direction and try to make you carry emotions that were never yours to begin with. On the outside, they may still appear confident, distant, or even cold, but inside they are fighting a battle they do not understand and do not know how to resolve. Your absence forces them to face truths they spent years avoiding. They are confronted with the reality that love cannot survive without respect, that control can never replace genuine connection, and that entitlement will never create real closeness. Even if they never admit it, even if those words never leave their lips, your decision to walk away becomes the moment that exposes everything they tried so hard to ignore. They need to convince themselves that you were deeply flawed, so they never have to face their own mistakes. They need to describe you as ungrateful, so they can avoid admitting how often they took your kindness for granted. They need you to become the villain in their story, because looking honestly at themselves feels far more frightening. Stay with me, because the next part explains why their reactions often become even more intense after you are gone. The irony is difficult to ignore. Their anger is rarely about hatred alone. At its core, it is fueled by fear. It is the fear of losing control. It is the fear of discovering they were wrong. Most of all, it is the quiet fear that you mattered far more than they ever allowed themselves to admit. Yet expressing fear, regret, or genuine heartbreak requires humility, emotional honesty, and self-awareness. Those are qualities they never fully developed. Without those emotional tools, anger becomes the language they understand best. They may lash out behind closed doors, create scenes in front of others, or withdraw into long periods of icy silence. But the goal remains remarkably similar. They want to regain a sense of power. They want to convince themselves that your absence means nothing. Yet the intensity of their reaction quietly reveals the opposite. Every burst of anger points toward the very emotions they are trying hardest to hide. Behind every accusation sits the same heavy shame they refuse to acknowledge. It hides beneath every criticism, every argument, and every rewritten version of the relationship they tell themselves and others. Since they cannot process that shame in a healthy way, they transform it into blame. Blame becomes their armor. It becomes the shield they hide behind whenever reality feels too uncomfortable. But keep watching, because what happens after that shield begins to weaken reveals even more. Eventually, the anger loses its force. Constantly rewriting the story becomes exhausting. Blaming you no longer brings the emotional relief it once did. That is when they come face to face with something they fear even more than accountability. They meet emptiness. A deep silence settles over them, and that quiet becomes unsettling in ways they rarely admit. For perhaps the first time in a long while, they are left alone with their own thoughts. That is often the place they fear most. Without you, the emotional support they quietly depended on is no longer there. The validation they received through your love, the attention they gained from creating conflict, and the emotional weight you carried on their behalf all disappear. It feels as though the source holding together their fragile confidence has suddenly been switched off. Many narcissistic people struggle to regulate their emotions in healthy, lasting ways. Instead, they rely heavily on other people to provide reassurance, stability, and a sense of identity. When you leave, that entire system begins falling apart. You remove the outside structure they leaned on to avoid facing what was happening within themselves. Your absence creates an emotional vacuum. It is not simply that you are gone. It is that the support holding together an unstable foundation has disappeared. Without it, everything inside begins to shake. They feel pressure in their chest, restlessness throughout their body, and an uneasiness they cannot clearly explain. They lack the emotional awareness to understand these feelings, so all they know is that the discomfort feels overwhelming. In response, they begin searching for anything that can fill the empty space. They look for replacements with growing urgency. They chase distractions, new relationships, fresh attention, or any situation that offers even a brief feeling of importance. They may become unusually active online, seek admiration from strangers, flirt for quick reassurance, or bury themselves in constant activity simply to avoid being alone with their thoughts. Yet none of those efforts truly solve the deeper problem. Nothing recreates what they once experienced with someone who genuinely cared. You were never just another source of praise or attention. You offered consistency. You offered patience. You gave something stable, sincere, and deeply human. That kind of connection is difficult to replace because it was built on genuine care rather than temporary excitement. As time passes, a realization slowly begins taking shape. They notice that very few people offer the same understanding you once did. Very few remain patient through changing moods or repeated contradictions. They often feel this most strongly during the quietest hours, late at night or early in the morning, when distractions fade and silence fills the room. Those still moments become uncomfortable because there is nothing left to hide behind. Without someone reflecting back the image they prefer to see, they are left alone with insecurity, self-doubt, confusion, and a painful sense of inadequacy they spent years avoiding. They tell themselves they have moved on, yet the emptiness continues to return. They insist they no longer care, yet their actions quietly suggest otherwise. They meet new people, but something always feels missing. Not because you were perfect, but because you offered a level of steadiness, compassion, and emotional presence that they never learned to give themselves. And that realization often lingers far longer than they ever expected.